It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to take the opportunity when invited. I thought it'd be good to update you on some of the things that have been happening in Canberra in the last few weeks and months, and then perhaps give you an outline of some of the thoughts about where we're going. And I refer specifically to workplace relations and matters affecting industrial relations, but depending on how you structure the meeting, I'm happy to take questions or indeed statements, which if you care to put a question mark on the end, I'm happy to listen to. But to begin with, it is a pleasure to be here at Labor Council. I've attended in the past in different capacities, mainly as a representative of the Australian Workers' Union. But I was saying to Chris that this would be one of the few, I reckon, strongly functioning Labor Councils in Australia. And it does reflect well on all of you that you're maintaining the traditions and the interest and the... I think it is you should be very pleased, because I think in other parts of Australia there isn't this sort of vibrant State Trade Union Council approach which is still here in Sydney. I've been the Minister for Workplace Relations since December the 15th. There's been a lot happening since then, not only in my own portfolio with reflection on industrial relations. In other portfolios we've seen reforms in the Navigation Act, which have seen, I think, an improvement in the position of organised labour in Australia in terms of both the debate about productivity and dealing with some of the outstanding issues from the Howard era, where ship flags of convenience and ships of shames were able to use Australian coastal waters. So there's been movement on that. That legislation's been introduced into the Parliament. We've also seen a debate about the future of the car industry, an ongoing commitment from the federal government to support the automotive industry for a range of good reasons, not just the jobs, but the multiplier effect in small business, the R&D, the employment of apprentices. We've also seen, more specifically in the financial services area, superannuation go from 9 to 12% over the next 8 years, which will mean that Australian workers will have more money to retire on than they otherwise would. My only regret with that legislation is that it got delayed throughout the period of the Howard years, and there's people approaching retirement now who don't have what they could have otherwise had if we'd been able to pursue these policies in those years of missed opportunity under the former Conservative government. We've also passed legislation through the House of Reps, and connected to the superannuation is the passing of the mining tax, which I think is a modest and legitimate endeavour to share the prosperity of the mining boom throughout the whole of the Australian economy. So that's been very positively received, except by the mining interests and the coalition. We've also saw passed on last Thursday night reforms to financial services and the activities of financial planners and the large financial interests to reform financial planning, and it's called the Future of Financial Advice. And the crossbenchers would say that legislation, this is the independents, the Green and indeed the other Conservative independents, say that they've received more lobbying against our changes on reforming financial planners and their activities than the carbon tax, the mining tax or any other piece of legislation. What's good is we got it through, and that'll travel to the Senate and that'll no doubt pass that. And some of the problems we've seen arise in the malfeasance and underperformance of Opus Prime, of Storm, of Trio. We're eliminating conflicted remuneration structures where if a financial planner gives you advice, they're acting for you. They're not taking kickback and commission from the product providers. So these are matters which are very relevant to the treatment of workers, but it's in the industrial relations area itself. I'd have to report to you that we have made significant progress at long last on a range of issues. Working closely with the TCFUA and representatives of the New South Wales branch as well, we've passed legislation through the Senate and Reps to improve the treatment and protections for outworkers in the textile, clothing, footwear industry, and I'm indebted to the union for the work they did in helping inform last-minute amendments to strengthen that legislation. Again, that was opposed by the coalition. We saw the handing down of the decision in the equal pay case in terms of the social and community services workers, and whilst that matter had been a long time in preparation and the New South Wales ASU had certainly been at the forefront of that campaign, that decision did get handed down, and of course the Commonwealth Government supported the propositions advanced by the union, and I think that's going to lead to very positive outcomes in the community services sector. In the building and construction industry, we finally moved on the abolition of the ABCC, the transference of regulatory functions to a mainstream body. We've also seen the implementation of new guidelines for procurement. There's still some further work to be done on those procurement guidelines, but the code and the legislation have been sitting around for a while, and we're able to move on that and get that done. We've also seen the passage of the safe rates legislation through the lower house, which is the creation of a safe rates tribunal to investigate the link between remuneration of truck drivers, owner-operators and road safety, with a capacity to create standards for an area of industry which has been analysed. The link between remuneration and safety has been analysed as far back as the late 70s, but it's now taken till now to get action, and the Transport Workers Union was certainly at the forefront of promoting that case and that legislation. That's now passed the House of Representatives. Again, that was a close vote. We've also been involved, apart from the transport industry, the construction industry, the textile, clothing, footwear industry, the community and social services area. I think you're seeing the first early green shoots of reforms in aged care, which I know Minister Butt will have more to say. I've mentioned the Navigation Act in the maritime industry. I've mentioned reforms in the financial services industry. I would submit to you who come to many meetings and hear many reports, that is a significant list in the last 3 months to get things done. I believe it gives you the opportunity as union organisers to hold your head up and to go into the factories and the yards and the hospitals and the bank sites and all of the workplaces which you represent and say this is a government who is keeping faith with its constituency. This is a government who's accomplishing things which quite frankly haven't been accomplished at any point in the history of the Commonwealth. There's been, of course, work in that other very important area of skills, and the government announced again last week, we're getting on with so much at the moment, there's a danger it gets lost, which I'll come back to at the end of my presentation. Skills. We all understand that whilst we fight hard for particular jobs to be maintained, we understand that unlike our parents and grandparents, there will not be one job for life, and that in fact many of the young ones and people coming through will have 8 or 9 jobs in their lifetime. And we also understand that in an increasingly borderless world that we need to make sure that people of all ages have the most appropriate set of skills to be able to adjust as jobs rise and jobs fall. So the skills package commitment that the Prime Minister announced is that every person, our aim is that every person up to the age of 65 will have the equivalent of a cert-free qualification. And we think that this is a good minimum. And even the employers have had to acknowledge that in the area of skills they feel we as a government have got on and doing far more than has been done previously. There's been lots of individual disputes which I've had the opportunity to assist with in one way or another, from waterfront negotiations to the Victorian nurses dispute to a range of other matters which are still unfolding. We've also seen that we've got some work coming up in the very near future. We've got the review of the Fair Work Act, we've got the review of the modern award system, we've got overdue work on apprenticeship wages and seeing what we can do to improve them. We've also got to look at the future of work generally. And this is probably the second of the 2 points I really wanted to make to you, and then talk a little bit about the government and campaigning. We understand, and you understand, that the model presented in some of the conservative elements of the media, that workplace relations is a battlefield, and that the conflict is the only model for workplace relations. We understand that your members, and I recall the members I used to represent, they actually want to go to work and be content in their job. They want to be secure in their job, they want to be safe in their job, they want to be well remunerated in their job. They do not seek conflict as the natural order. But there is a way that the coalition present industrial relations, that somehow it's all about where the pendulum on regulation sits, and there is a myth in the community that somehow if we could just kill off all the unions, Australian workplaces would enter a new golden age of productivity. There is a myth promulgated by conservative interests that if we could just kill off all workplace regulation, we'd have a new golden era of productivity. Now, whilst I reject the idea that all industrial relations is hand-to-hand combat, I also reject this myth, and the government, everyone in the government rejects this myth, that if it was but for unions or but for industrial regulation, Australian enterprise would be doing a lot better. I believe the opposite to be true. I believe that when we talk about the future of work, unions are witness to the changes that have been underway for not the last year or 12 months, but the last 30 years. At the moment, this Australian economy is going well in parts and not so well in other parts. We have a high Australian dollar, which is giving a whole lot of trade-exposed sectors an enormously difficult time. It's accelerating a lot of the debate and change which is happening in a whole lot of sectors and industries. We are terribly conscious of the impact upon jobs of the high dollar. But we also understand that jobs are being created in a range of sectors. that compared to the United States, where unemployment on average is 8.3%, unemployment in Australia is 5.2%. Now, I understand that that's cold comfort if you've just lost your job. But what I also understand is that compared to the United States and in the Euro region, unemployment's north of 10%, and that's the average. I understand there are pockets of youth unemployment in Australia. I understand there are regions of Australia doing it harder. But I also know that this country's passing what I call the airport test. Most Australians, when they've been overseas and come back to Australia, know this country is doing relatively better than the rest of the world. But not for 1 second does that mean that I believe that we couldn't be doing better, or that all is good, or that all is equal. But we've just, our net debt, and the opposition love to bang on, oh, this country's in debt. Barnaby Joyce said something about we weren't going to be able to sign the cheques next week because of our debt, that was a real issue. I mean, what a lie. Our net debt is going to top out at 8.9%. What that means, without using fancy economic terms, is it's what the government borrows to do the business of government. It's 8.9% of GDP. Imagine if you and your households, and I can't speak behind the bank books and balance sheets of all your households, but imagine if you had an annual income of which you only owed 8.9% of the total of your annual income. You'd probably go and borrow some more money. And that's where Australia's at. We are doing very well. We are determined to go to surplus. There's some who say, don't worry about going into surplus. Going into surplus is important because we want to exert downward pressure on interest rates. One of the reasons why we have a high Australian dollar is because the mining boom is certainly pumping steroids into the dollar in terms of we've got a high-priced product and people are interested in our currency. But there's another reason why people are interested in the Australian currency. It's because compared to some other parts of the world, the cash rate of money set by the independent agency of the Reserve Bank is 4.25%. So that means that a mum and dad depositor in Japan who are lucky to get 100 cents back in every dollar, there are 100 yen in every 100 yen. I won't pursue that analogy any further. The point is they're just barely getting back what they put in the bank. Whereas in Australia, because of our high interest rates, or relatively high returns for depositors, it's 6.5%, 7%. So our currency is attractive because our interest rates are at 4.25%. It's not the highest around the world, but it's certainly better than some other parts of the world. Getting into surplus is a way of putting downward pressure on those rates. Now, I think that the high Australian dollar is one of the key challenges going forward, but there's challenges in our workplaces too, more general challenges. I said that there are changes underway in the Australian economy, and I think part of a challenge of being a member of Parliament is that you've got to, and being a minister, is you can't just look at the next opinion poll or the next 24-hour news cycle. I think the voters want us to look just not only at the next election, but beyond the next election, and what's our path for the next 20 years? So that's why I think the future of work is a fundamental story about the future of Australia. We spend a third of our life at work. It is upon our work that most of us will rely to have a comfortable retirement. We're living longer than ever before, and that means that we need to have earned and tried to save enough money for our 20 and 30 years of retirement. And of course, many of us haven't. We also are concerned about the future of work and where we're going in the next 20 years because, frankly, we want to know what's going to happen to our kids. We want to know what's going to happen to our grandkids when they go to work. Are we going to be a generation who passes on better conditions or inferior conditions? So there is a big debate, which I believe the Labor movement is centrally placed to be the navigators to the future of what happens in our workplaces and therefore what happens in Australia. We understand the trends which are underway and we've been part of it by and large. We understand that there is more people than ever working in Australia. It's 11.5 million approximately. We understand that about 65 in every 100 Australians is going to work. 10 years ago, when they were looking at the ageing population, we were worried that it would fall away. The reality is people are still working. Now, whether or not you celebrate that depends, I suppose, on the job you've got. But the point about it is we are working longer than ever and we are staying at work longer than we perhaps would have thought possible 10, 15 and 20 years ago. Women increasingly are taking their overdue place in leadership in the workplace. Now, before those who say that can't happen soon enough, fair enough. But what I'd say to you is that this is one of the long-term trends. And the participation rate of women in Australia is steadily climbing. So that's something that's happening. Another thing which is happening is that I think increasingly people are rebelling against the 1 hour commute to work and the 1 hour commute home. We all have an aspiration to live closer to our work. As union officials, you more than most know how far you have to travel in your job. That's an occupational hazard of the job. But we also know that Australians, I think, want to be closer to their work. So there's a challenge there about where the jobs of the future are going to be and what locations. This idea that everyone's going to uproot from the western suburbs of Sydney or Melbourne and go and live in the Pilbara and Port Hedland is a fiction, especially if you've ever been to Port Hedland. They're going to have to do a lot of changes there before anyone wants to go and live there for a period of time, I can tell you. So we're seeing trends about where we live and have proximity to work. We're seeing the impact that the internet is making. I see the internet, it's not just something that people are on Facebook on, it's, I see it, for instance, in something as obscure, or maybe not as obscure, depending on your social habits, but in racetracks. Corporate bookmaking, international bookmaking, is seeing the traditional business model of the racing industry in the big states break down, because the bigger states collect revenue off the bricks and mortar operations, but a bookie in Darwin isn't paying the same sort of charges back into the industry, into government, which helps keep the racing industry vibrant. We see it in the debate about the GST. How do you collect the GST on items less than $1,000? And how expensive is it to collect versus tax leakage where people are bringing in goods underneath $1,000? We see it in the recent decision of, or capacity of Optus to use what they call cloud computing. I don't want to take any questions on cloud computing because I'm not sure I could explain it. But what I do understand is that Optus recently had a case in court where what they are doing with their technology is they can televise a football match 2 minutes after real time. Now, the thing about that is, did it infringe the Copyright Act? And a judge said no, it didn't, because it wasn't at the same time. That's going to challenge the whole business model of sport, because all the major football codes and other sports rely on TV sponsorship. But why on earth will a TV station pay sponsorship if you can just download the game 2 minutes later and watch it in real time? So the internet is changing the way we do retail. It's changing the way the structure of sport is changing the way we bet and collect our taxes. So these are massive changes. I believe that the time is right and appropriate for the union movement to be part of the debate about what our future workplaces look like. Now, we've got this review of the Fair Work Act. We understand that that's the employers are certainly making a sustained campaign that the pendulum's swung far too far in favour of unions. The government remains to be convinced of that proposition. We also have debates about where we go in terms of adequate retirement savings for Australians, the skills debate. How do we make sure that as the high dollar impacts on the Australian economy, how do we support our jobs? So friends, there is a great deal underway, and the coalition, and this is the final point I make about campaigning and the government, there is no question that the government needs to do fewer things more effectively, and when we do something we need to make sure that we don't move off the next day, we don't get sucked into the constant demand, tell us something new, give us a new announcement. What I've listed there, I believe, is a significant body of work and a significant body of accomplishment. Stories which organisers can talk to their members in the work sites and say, this is why unions take an interest in politics, is to see the sort of legislation which is making its path through the parliaments of Australia. But be under no illusion. I sit in Parliament, I watch the coalition, they hate trade unions. Again, you know this, you've just seen what Premier O'Farrell's doing in New South Wales. But the coalition in Canberra are determined. They don't like the existence of industry funds. I have no doubt that they'll use internal turmoil in trade unions to justify reforms to union governance. You've seen the decisions in New South Wales about the ability to get involved in politics of state branches. The coalition don't support an increase in superannuation. They want to paint it as a tax on business. They don't want to recognise that superannuation increases come from the increase in productive capacity of businesses generated by the work of workers. They don't understand that concept at all. They certainly are unhappy with our reforms in the textile industry. They're unhappy, they say there's no linkage between safety and the rates in the transport industry. I listened carefully to the debates. They say that the construction industry needs all of the sort of powers and operation that's been in existence, which we've now started to deal with. And they certainly don't believe that, they believe that the number of matters which can be dealt in an individual flexibility arrangement in an EBA should be extended. They don't understand or accept that transmission of business laws should protect people when businesses get sold, that people don't have radical drops in their conditions. So there is a fierce agenda out there. But what I believe I can report to you this evening is that in the last 4 years, I think we've seen the culmination of 4 years' work start to come to fruition in the last 3 months. And I think that there is a story which you can tell to members which says this is a government who understands who voted for it, and understands who put it there, and understands its obligations, and also understands that the future of work is an important culmination. It doesn't matter if it's the national broadband network and how that helps business. It doesn't matter if it's the improvement in skills and how that helps workplaces. It doesn't matter about putting a price on sustainable carbon, the use of carbon in the future. It understands that we need to have retirement savings in the future. I believe, and having been in the place that many of you have been in and had to do the tasks that many of you have had to do, I believe I can report to you tonight, this is a government who is getting on with the business of the Labor movement, and I believe that it's a good story and a good report to give tonight. Thanks very much for listening.